Hello and welcome back to Parley. True Mr.FOoT paid for this one. If you're not them, I hope you'll enjoy listening. Let's see what they have to say. True Mr.FOoT's going to do a parlay about what game difficulty even is. Mr.FOoT says, hello and welcome back to Parley. Thanks for welcoming people. This month we will see my attempt at a game design parlay and how that goes horribly wrong in the end. I will take you on my 3-month journey of discovering and losing the meaning of game difficulty. This prompt will consist of 3 acts. Feel free to pause after each act and discuss what was mentioned. Yep, that's what we'll do. Prologue. Words are hard. First, let's define game difficulty for the context of this parlay. Feel free to disagree, but Mr.FOoT says difficulty is what prevents a player from the otherwise trivial task of completing a challenge in a game. The level of complexity in this problem corresponds to the level of difficulty. If you go by this definition, one might wonder how it is that opinions on game difficulty vary as much as they do. All right, yeah, I have a few notes. I think that's a perfectly usable definition of difficulty. What makes it, what gets in the way of you completing a task. Like if something isn't difficult, if it's easy in every way, if something is easy in every way, then you should be able to complete it instantly. You just have to go through, again, if it's infinitely easy. If something is pretty easy, you might have to do a few things or think about it for a sec or whatever. But if something was the most easy, you essentially wouldn't need to accomplish it. There would be nothing in the way of you accomplishing it. Is that fair to think of it that way? So difficulty is what makes that not the case. Why isn't it already done, basically? What needs doing about it? What do you actually have to do to complete it? Difficulty is the set of the demands or conditions that must be met. More of them, or how much more complicated they are, sure, increases the difficulty. I don't have too much to say here. I think it's worth noting, like I've read ahead, of course, and this is a topic in game design I've thought about before. I think it's worth noting we're going to go on to talk about how difficulty is a little suspect as a concept. How real is some of the difficulty that people frequently talk about. I do personally think that there are still some remaining forms of maybe slightly more contrived difficulty. If you add conditions, I think things can be meaningfully difficult in a way that they aren't if you just go by this parlay. So I am going to conclude. I want to put a footnote here. We're not going to spoil the surprise. But at the end of this parlay, I do have some conclusions about things I think still are like meaningfully difficult. I think there are forms of difficulty other than the ones we're now going to talk about, but I don't want to spoil that ahead of time. Anything else? Just checking my notes. Yeah, so again, just the definition. Difficulty, Mr.FOoT says, is what prevents a player from the otherwise trivial task of completing a challenge in a game. Again, you could think of it as, I worded it as the things that make it so you even have to achieve a task. Why isn't it done instantly? Why does it even need to be achieved? What is in the way of it getting done? Okay, Act 1, boxes. I like the act names. My approach to this differing perception of difficulty, Mr.FOoT says, is that there are 4 separate types. Every game's challenges consist of a mixture of all 4 of these categories. Number 1, mechanical difficulty. This is the only category almost everyone will agree on. This includes the ability to time a button press, execute a series of inputs, reaction speed, or precisely aiming the camera. Okay, I follow you so far. Number 2, strategic difficulty. Games like trading card games have almost no mechanical difficulty, but few people would call them easy. Instead, they are full of strategic or decision-based difficulty. This includes both gameplay decisions, like what enemy to prioritize or something, and menu-based decisions, colloquially referred to as buildcraft, or just building your deck in a trading card game. Okay. Number 3, knowledge-based difficulty. There's a difference between making a decision, strategic difficulty, and knowing one of the options is superior. This category includes knowing game mechanics, enemy weaknesses, optimal routes, flowcharts, etc. Okay? And finally, number 4, mathematical difficulty. Sometimes a challenge can be inapproachable despite players overcoming all of the above. This is where mathematical difficulty comes in. It's defined by increasing numbers through the player's use of real-world time and/or money. Examples of this are grinding for upgrade materials, money or level ups, or spending money in a pay-to-win economy to get a direct advantage or to skip the aforementioned grind. Another type of mathematical difficulty may include getting the correct RNG to complete a challenge. Yeah, just doing it enough times that the conditions you need happen, or the loot you're looking for has the right stats or something. Sure. Okay. In other words, if the difficulty of a game is a problem that needs to be solved, then mathematical difficulty is your ability to attempt the problem based on your current state. Knowledge-based difficulty is knowing what the problem is. Strategical difficulty is creating a plan to solve the problem, and mechanical difficulty is executing your plan. I really like that part. We'll come back to it in a minute. If you look at the classic hard game, Dark Souls, you can see how a challenge like a boss fight can be overcome by tackling different aspects of difficulty. You could improve your mechanical skill, change your build or in-battle strategy, look up the weakness of the boss, or just grind levels to make every other aspect irrelevant. Players have different aptitudes for different approaches, and not everyone considers each of these aspects to be real difficulty. This is how opinions on difficulty can differ as much as they do. As a side note, you might consider a fifth category, like psychological difficulty, that develops through things like mind games in PvP games. This category of difficulty can be viewed as a branch that is separate from strategical difficulty and is not supposed to be part of this parlay. Cool, we won't talk about PvP. Indeed, I think that's very different from this subject. Right, the first thing I want to talk about is mathematical difficulty. That name tripped me up initially. Maybe it would help some people to also call it numerical difficulty. Mathematical difficulty, you might think something like running an equation, or like knowing the amount of damage you need to kill a boss before its enrage timer or something. But this difficulty we're referring to is just making the numbers go up. You could refer to it as grinding, that just, I think, including things like spending money for the pay to win. You can grind real world money and then spend it, in the game. So those are more or less the same. We'll get back more into that later. I really like the bit where you gave really good examples, the bit where you talked about how a problem has each of these 4 difficulty pieces as steps, and you can see how different types of game do or don't turn up or down those different types. So, for example, in a trading card game, like in the example before, we were saying strategical difficulty is creating a plan to solve the problem, and mechanical difficulty is executing your plan. Trading card games have very little mechanical difficulty, if any at all, usually because you don't need to do almost anything to execute your plan. You can simply hit the buttons on the menu or UI that cause the thing you want to do to happen. There's no margin of error in doing it unless you misclick, basically. The place you have to click on the screen is very big, and the timing is not very precise, like very imprecise, right? It's turn-based. There's not much rush. You could think of it as, if a trading card game was a Dark Souls boss fight, then, you don't have to time your quote dodge roll very carefully at all. In fact, you basically don't have to time it. You have such a wide window for timing your dodge roll playing your card that it doesn't even feel like it is timing anymore. Yes, you usually have a turn timer in trading card games. You can't just take your turn forever. But I mean, we're talking, you have like a minute, there is no need to think about like when, you play your thing generally. So you can see how that model of difficulty eliminates difficulty from places where it feels like it is. There is basically no mechanical difficulty in trading card games for most folks. So yeah, I like this model overall. I think that's useful. I think it's interesting to consider, but at the beginning I didn't know what you meant by how opinions on difficulty can differ as much as they do, but I'm beginning to understand. It's this idea that people will discuss whether a game was hard or not. It doesn't seem like that should be subjective when you look at it a certain way. Were there a lot of things you needed to do to complete the task? Were there or weren't there? It doesn't seem like it would be very subjective when you look at it that way. But people disagree extensively about why a game is hard. You could, if you've watched a lot of my parlay, you might know something I'm tempted to say here, which is that part of the reason people argue about what is difficult is because they don't mean the same thing by the word difficult. They didn't do what Mr. FOoT did and define the word difficult at the beginning of the parlay. they haven't paired it out. They haven't read this 3-page Google document about difficulty in video games, right? So sure, of course, some of it is semantic confusion. Many of those people actually agree or pretty close to it, but they just don't know because there's a confusion of terms. Of course, that being said, I do think what you demonstrated is a great setup for why there is such a lack of consensus about difficulty. So let's continue. Act 2, rephrasing the question. If we're being honest with ourselves, Mr. Foot says, our original definition does not include many things that players consider difficult. For one reason, we never properly defined this ominous challenge. If the only challenge is completing the content and seeing the credits, and you use every tool that is available to you, from looking up strategies to every tool a game offers to questioning your own understanding of game mechanics to just spending the time to do the grind, then most games are trivial to almost anyone as far as their objective challenges are concerned. The problem in this argument are self-imposed limitations. There are many reasons for these. Some of them might include valuing your own time so you challenge yourself to do objectives more quickly, avoiding game elements for balance, roleplay, or variety, surprisingly often player pride. The interesting thing here is that our discussions around difficulty are often focused on these very subjective, self-imposed limitations. An important factor in this section is that there's nothing inherently wrong with self-imposed limitations, and that they often happen subconsciously and without the player even noticing that they're happening. It's only through carefully looking at the ways in which we play games that we can identify self-imposed limitations as self-imposed and separate them from the real game, as it were. There is also the topic of frustration, which is what happens when the player is unable to solve the game's challenge with their current approach and is not willing to change their approach due to self-imposed limitations. Such limitations might include, again, pride to keep a high difficulty setting, or an unwillingness to invest the time necessary to properly learn a boss pattern. This frustration inhibits a player's ability to deal with all 4 types of difficulty and ends up in an unproductive cycle, and that often leads to incorrect value judgments about games. Okay, a lot to discuss here. So Mr. Foot has played their cards. The turn here, Mr. Foot's proposition for why games seem to be evaluated so differently on their difficulty is because there's a kind of hidden addition to the game's conditions. The challenges you need to overcome the task are not just a list of things provided by the game. Usually there are some added by the player. We're using a very, very wide definition of self-imposed limitations here. Especially I want to focus on, I think, the biggest one in some ways, valuing your own time so you challenge yourself to do objectives more quickly. People won't attempt a challenge infinite times, generally. And so there's a kind of hidden challenge that the game will let you try as often as you want most of the time. Most games, most challenges, there isn't really a reason you can't just keep trying. There are a few games like that, but almost always, you could keep playing, right? But the player won't keep playing. They will eventually stop, right? And so there's an extra challenge involved. You have to complete the challenge in front of you in a certain number of tries that the game did not decide. Now, again, as Mr. Foot said, it's important to really focus on self-imposed limitations, make it sound like you should just overcome them, right? But that's ridiculous for some of these. Again, I almost worry about naming them that. These are things that any sane person would have to have. Like, you can't not have self-imposed limitations with this definition of them. These are things that are just you are a person and not a robot. And so you do have these. You can't not have them. Everybody has them. I think that's very important to drive home. Again, self-imposed limitations that might make people think. Anyway, indeed, most games are arguably trivial if you're willing to play them any way you could possibly play them. Surely, people feel like, well, this is really hard, which means I don't want to do it, or I'm not aware of the way I could do it, to do the thing, and that's just another form of difficulty. So yeah, I think that this is a powerful statement. I agree, by the way. I think that this is a compelling psychological position. It is the case that people add these conditions to games. I agree with this parlay's eventual conclusion, but I didn't think of it this way. This is interesting. The idea that there are quite a few limitations that fall under this group along with the one I always think of, which is player pride. Like the player feels there's some negative value judgment to not playing the game at a higher level. Now I wanna pick that apart a little. I think it's more complicated. Some of that pride is the player wanting to show off to other people, which is, again, that's okay, but it is just immaturity. There's not much to discuss there. Players will just grow out of feeling like they need to play a game good to look valid to other people. Like, you don't. If you feel like you do, that's okay. You're not pathetic for feeling that way, but you don't. That is a thing that people will just grow out of. That's not an avoidable problem. Some of these are limitations that you would want to move on from. People will move on from. But I think it's important to highlight that there's another element of sticking to the same difficulty, which is the human desire to persevere. Like, there's just a feeling like I want to feel like I overcame a challenge. And so it looks like pride, but the player is keen to have there be a challenge that they overcame, to feel like the journey was worth it and they triumphed over something. That can be some of the fun of playing a game. And so there's definitely an element of developer balance here. I think that the most objective difficulty gets is that if a game isn't very smoothly balanced for most people, which again, that's pretty subjective, but it's not completely subjective, the game will feel, more people will say that it was hard or the difficulty didn't feel good because there was something that makes it hard for the player to calibrate their own self-imposed limitations. You could argue that having fun in a game, fun is a self-imposed limitation, and it's the difficult one. That's what's hard about a game. Playing the game, clearing the game isn't challenging, but having fun while doing that is challenging. And you could argue the games are more or less hard depending on how hard it is to have fun playing them for individual people. That's not, in my opinion, a helpful definition, by the way. I just think it's interesting to note that fun, I would say, is the biggest self-imposed limitation. The game doesn't say you have to have fun, right? That's you saying you have to have fun. Again, that's why we really got to drive home this thing about self-imposed limitations. It would be ridiculous to not want to have fun ever when playing any type of game. Like, maybe some games you might play and not, your self-imposed limitation wouldn't be to have fun. But you're telling me you play a meaningful variety of games, and in none of them do you care at all about having fun. Like, that's crazy, right? And so I think that this is a super compelling point, a really strong foundation to move on to part 3, which Mr. Foot calls an inconvenient truth. After I got over these self-imposed limitations, I noticed a trend throughout many hugely different games. People are lazy. Over time, players tend toward playstyles that remove as much mechanical difficulty as possible. This is sometimes done to trade a self-imposed challenge for time saves. An interesting aspect of buildcraft and strategic difficulty at large is that you can make decisions that remove mechanical difficulty. A simple example is area of effect weapons in Warframe that remove the need for aiming. I would argue that this kind of removal of mechanical skill, where possible, is inevitable in any game and will be found sooner rather than later. Furthermore, most games are not that complex. Given enough time and experience, any decision turns into knowledge. Players know all the best options, and at that point there is no more need for strategy, and knowledge-based difficulty is limited in scope, eliminated from any challenge if the player is given enough time to learn everything. Notice that a time requirement is really similar to mathematical difficulty. If mechanical difficulty cannot be removed to the point of triviality, and there are no external factors like disabilities at play, then overcoming them becomes a time investment to acquire the input consistency and muscle memory to overcome the problem. The problem with that is that mechanical difficulty is now also indistinguishable from mathematical difficulty if it is purely defined by a requirement in time investment. Now we've learned that 3 of our 4 categories can either be removed or replaced with mathematical difficulty. This leads us with the only real and objective kind of difficulty, and it's the ugly one. The only kind that abstractly defines a challenge is how much time a player wants or needs to invest into solving it. In other words, the solution to our problem itself might not be reduced to time, but all ways to acquire the solution are by spending time in a mathematical way, like mathematical difficulty. Shout out to Den Soro for this thought, Mr. Foot says. I don't have a high opinion of games that are based around mathematical difficulty. In my experience, they are unanimously not worth your time. But if every difficult game boils down to time investment, then all hard games are bad, which feels wrong to say. Maybe the lesson here is that in the end, there is no merit to being, quote, good at a, quote, hard video game, because it is nothing but a reflection of how much time you've invested. And if a game is, quote, too hard for you, then it's because of a self-imposed time limitation that prevents you from completing it, and not necessarily the quality of the game itself. Oh boy, a lot to discuss. So basically, the thing that's happened is that when you realize that a lot of the real challenge is self-imposed difficulty, and all four of those types of difficulty at the beginning can actually just be overcome by spending a bunch of time. And the only reasons people wouldn't do that are self-imposed difficulties that are not part of the game. That's how Mr.FOoT words it anyway. All difficulty in the game, in the text of the game, boils down to just spending more time on it. For the most part, I think it's hard to disagree with this. When people say that a game is hard because it requires a lot of mechanical difficulty, this is the one I always come down hard on. I've always been puzzled by that in the sense that anybody should be able to do this as long as the game isn't so ridiculously challenging that it requires, for some people, inhuman levels of reaction time. And of course, some people have different physical abilities, but by and large, if the game is possible, then mechanical difficulty is meaningless because you just spent a ton of time overcoming something the developers gave you no ability to overcome other than spending a lot of time overcoming it. Does that make sense? So I always come down really hard on mechanical difficulty. I feel like it seems to me, it's always felt to me, this is going to be me being even more harsh than Mr.FOoT. It always seems to me like people who value mechanical difficulty or mechanical skill, it kind of feels like they must not know about other forms of difficulty because mechanical, like mathematical difficulty, is the one that means nothing about you except that you spent a huge amount of time doing that thing. I think the place that this has gotten complicated for me over the years is when you acknowledge that if you actually do spend all of that time learning, it's usually a mechanical skill, you're not grinding away like with mathematical difficulty, where you chip away at the thing, and this is like an experience bar going up, right? Throughout the course of, let's say it takes 12 hours to overcome a piece of mathematical difficulty. Over the course of that 12 hours, the game gives you a progress bar and a reward system that helps structure the time that you spend. You are basically just pissing away 12 hours, but the game makes it, I hope you'll be okay with the simplification, as easy as possible psychologically to do that. Mechanical difficulty, however, usually doesn't involve that type of thing. Usually, the player just has to self-structure 12 hours of, like, training, you could word it as, where the game gives them no reward, and there isn't actually a guarantee of victory either. Like, the player has to be good at learning, and you can learn much faster, of course. Like, there's better learning and worse learning, more active, less active learning. And so it does say more about the player. It is more variable, more individualistic, whether the player will overcome mechanical difficulty that has an average time of 12 hours than mathematical difficulty that has an average time of 12 hours. The player has to put in more of themselves, I guess, in terms of willpower, I guess. Now, again, I'm always critical of this because it feels to me like, but why? Why don't I just play a game where I can have the experience of overcoming adversity without spending so much of my time? Why do I have to spend time to have the experience of overcoming adversity? And a lot of people that are really infatuated with mechanical difficulty view that as being lazy. But again, I think there's a real problem here. You decide however you want to feel about that. I'm not trying to say mechanical difficulty is meaningless. There are acknowledgeable merits to being able to do that as a human. Time and time again, humans have to do a thing that boils down to mechanical difficulty. So we can all understand that there's some merit in being able to do these things if you have to. But if the only reason games are hard in the first place is because we want to have fun, I do think it's worth suggesting that maybe a form of difficulty that just boils down to spending a lot of time. I mean, what? Are there not enough games to play? You know what I mean? Like, there's There's other stuff to do. You don't have to spend longer on one game. You could have more fun with more games. Again, to me, this is very critical. This is a big mechanical difficulty hater thing to say. But it always feels to me like when people like mechanical difficulty, it's as if they don't know or can't access or they haven't experienced the fulfillment of overcoming other forms of difficulty, because I feel like they are as meaningful. They just don't take as long, basically. And they don't give you carpal tunnel. I don't know. So I hope you follow me so far. I think I'm going to go on to argue that there actually is a bit of a distinction between types of difficulty, but I definitely buy into the general gist that most of the things we've talked about so far boil down to overcoming a time barrier, right? I want to note, though, that mechanical difficulty and mathematical difficulty are things that you cannot eliminate some other way. Whereas knowledge-based difficulty or strategic difficulty, these are things that can, I would argue, will more dramatically fluctuate depending on the individual. And I think that because games and the fun we get from them are a self-imposed condition, it comes from us, it's more meaningful to have a type of difficulty that depends on the person more. That's where I'm going with this. Mathematical difficulty, then, is the lowest form of difficulty, if you want to say it that way, because it depends the least on the individual. It really has nothing to do with you when mathematical difficulty is overcome. It just kind of, you went through the motions. It literally could have been anyone just doing the thing if the difficulty was purely mathematical. Mechanical difficulty is kind of a notch above that, where yeah, like you could be better at learning, more active at learning, more determined, more structured, more aware of what's going badly and what's going well, and your learning speed will improve. It's more of a personal experience when you overcome mechanical difficulty. But I would argue it's much more, even more and much more of a personal experience when you overcome strategic or knowledge-based difficulty. Knowledge-based difficulty first. I think that a lot of unsung excitement about knowledge-based difficulty is that it's very transferable between games. For me, this would be the example of understanding multipliers. When you enter a new game, you can figure out how to effectively make builds in that game if it has like ways to increase your damage and stuff, by understanding principles that are not specific to any single game. So for example, in Warframe, you tend to use your mod slots to add as many unique multipliers as possible. And the reason for that is that I'm talking about myself, I have understood outside the context of Warframe that for there to be different stats that are worth equipping, they have to give you relatively similar amounts of them, and they have to multiply. If they didn't, then there would be no reason to even code those things into the game. So either the game is completely pointless, or it is worth using, most of the stats in the game. And then we can just check the numbers on the stats to make sure they actually do give you similar amounts. We then essentially know that more or less the most damage you can get from the game is acquired by mixing the stats. And then we can just do that, and we will have acquired, the most damage you can get in that game. The game is then interesting or engaging, to me anyway, based on how that process is. Is there a reason to pick different stats than others from time to time, despite the fact that in a vacuum, mathematically, you should mix them all equally. Going to Genshin Impact, you see a game where, again, the game gives you about the same amount of the damage stats available, so you can combine them in as equal parts as possible to get roughly the maximum damage you could get, except in Genshin Impact, for example, there's different amounts of outside support. It's much more common to buff attack and elemental mastery than crit and damage percent. And so those stats go up in value a little. You've got different team compositions, it iterates it from there. In Dead Cells, when you claim a scroll that gives you a certain color of stat, red, green, or purple, you notice that the game actually compounds the amount of damage you get if you pick that color again. So while you might initially gain 15% damage for green items from picking a green scroll, I don't remember exactly, by the way, Dead Cells people, please give me a break here. If you take a second green scroll, you don't get only 15% more damage added to your total. The game actually gives you more than 15%, and more and more and more the more green scrolls you pick. This means that you get rewarded for stacking one stat, which a player who understands this principle will think, oh, that probably overcomes the mathematical advantage of spreading them out, and if they don't multiply, then I should just stack one stat. So even though that game appears to break the rule, you can understand a principle of game design outside of any of those three games that tells you how to get good damage in all three games, even though they're more or less pretty different. How you would decide how meaningful the decision is in different ways is more or less different. That is, knowledge-based difficulty, I would argue, actually boils down much more to your mental machines, the systems you've thought of to understand a system, rather than looking up the solution, which I would argue is actually, the way you've described it, Mr. Foot, surprisingly unhelpful a lot of the time. Have you played a game and looked up the single consensus on how to do everything in the game? If you've done this, you'll know there usually isn't one. Like there's a variety of strategies offered that might mostly work, sure. But just to say that, again, this is a more personal form of difficulty. While it can be boiled down to just spending a lot of time on it, it is a type of difficulty that is much, much more reactive to you as a person. If you've thought about game design, if you've understood games outside of this specific game, you will take to this game with your own unique spin, take to its systems with your own unique ability to comprehend them and sort them out and wield them. And that brings us to strategic difficulty, which I think is basically the key to solving this like difficulty doesn't exist, it's all just time thing. Strategic difficulty can be improvisational difficulty. It can be done the most effectively in a way where you don't really have time to overcome it with a time investment. You see an enemy for the first time. It is a self-imposed difficulty to not just pause the game and look it up. But I would argue this is the simplest thing to do. If you simply play the game, you don't do anything out of the ordinary. Strategic difficulty is the one that feels the most meaty to me, the most substantial. You gain a dramatic difference in experience and a very different kind of experience by thinking about strategy differently from other players, how other players might, from the developers maybe. Your open-ended interpretation of how to tackle the game is a much more personal experience that I would argue leads to more fun. It's more in line with the fact that you're playing the game with self-imposed limitations to try to have fun, and your strategic difficulty is going to be an approach that is calibrated to your interests. You're going to do things in a way that are guided by your desire to have fun. They're embracing those self-imposed limitations a little more. And it's less deterministic if you were to look up strategic difficulty. You could read about strategy in the game, of course. You could copy people's builds and such. But because the strategic difficulty elements of a game are designed so that there isn't one answer more of the time than the other elements, you have more of an ability to actually play yourself. Again, it's more in line with the idea that you don't actually need this to be hard. You're playing it in a way you want to, which makes it hard. Let me give you an example, just in case that seems confusing. Mechanical difficulty. The timing to dodge an attack in a game is coded into the game. Knowledge-based difficulty. An enemy's elemental weaknesses are coded into the game. It's not subjective what they are. There aren't different elemental weaknesses depending on your playstyle, right? Like the enemy has a weakness to fire. That's what the game has given them, right? This boss has, this attack that you can avoid a variety of ways. Knowing the attack is knowledge-based difficulty that does not change. You look it up and there it is. Yeah, you can understand these systems around the game. Like I described, like having good damage or something. You could call that strategic difficulty too, if you'd like. But your strategy to deal with those things, that is a much more inherently open-ended thing. After all, if it wasn't, there wouldn't really be a point in allowing the player to play. This would be something like a game that involves maybe knowledge and probably mathematical difficulty, but also mechanical difficulty, but not strategic difficulty, would be something like a rhythm game, maybe. It's possible that you could gain, you could get power-ups and stuff in a rhythm game, but you can't have a different strategy for how to push the one button you need to push to hit the note. I mean, you could hit the controller differently, I suppose, but I would argue that's mechanical difficulty. Does that make sense? I know that was wordy. I don't have a great way to form that thought. But in my eyes, the thing that sets these difficulties apart is that while they might all boil down to the amount of time they take to overcome, which you could argue is kind of meaningless, the way to resolve this that I think makes sense based on our experience is that, yeah, like mathematical difficulty is silly because it doesn't have much to do with you. It just does take this amount of time or this amount of money, for example. And mechanical difficulty, knowledge based difficulty are maybe a little less like that. They're more personal. Strategic difficulty is, I think, deeply personal. It's the only one that I would argue is kind of intended to be personal. It's built to be open ended. And thus, I personally don't think that forms of difficulty other than strategic are meaningful. I don't really consider them difficulty. They are. I'm saying it this way to make the point bluntly. I don't necessarily judge you terribly for feeling differently, but I feel that they are a waste of time. If a game heavily focuses on mechanical or knowledge-based difficulty, I feel like why am I studying or practicing instead of having fun, instead of doing the thing that is making my brain do the thing, I guess. Now, by the way, it doesn't have to be very heavily mentally intensive. There are people who really enjoy playing Warframe, for example, by relaxing and playing their build they set up. I would argue that those players are experiencing very little of all four categories of difficulty. However, strategic difficulty to me is the one that is the most meaningfully there. They did make that loadout. They didn't make it this play session, probably. They're just hanging out and playing some of the game. But when players play a game with build systems and roll into the game to do their thing, they're probably playing a game in a way where they don't have to worry that much about, maybe they're not grinding for something, or again, the mathematical difficulty is very relaxed. The mechanical difficulty, it's probably something they've gotten used to. Low mechanical and knowledge-based difficulty, or eliminated mechanical and knowledge-based difficulty, are arguably the marks of something relaxing. However, strategic difficulty, the kind that isn't taking place right now, but that they still did engage with, is playing a role. Like they created a strategy, a loadout, or a build, possibly not during this play session, that is affecting their play experience the most, is what I'm getting at. That's why I think that that type of difficulty is the most meaningful, because linear difficulty is what's meaningless. Open-ended difficulty is embracing the idea that the real challenge is making the player have fun, not overcoming a set challenge. You'll notice the difficulty balancing in a lot of build-focused games is loose as well, because it's not really necessary for it to be really strict. If it were, that would just take more time. Who cares? Like, why? There's no point. But if it's relatively open-ended, yet you do have to come up with how you get there, as long as the game provides you with an easy time unlocking the tools to make a build, and an easy onboarding process learning how builds work in the game, how the game systems work, and reasonably comfortable controls, well, we've largely eliminated mathematical, knowledge-based, and mechanical difficulty, yet we still have a meaningful form of mental chewing that we can enjoy, strategic difficulty. And better yet, you don't even have to do it each time to engage with that part of the game. You could make a build and then play it later in games like that. So personally, that's part of why I hold making builds in such high regard. To put it another way, you could be extreme and say games without build systems are pointless. I think that's extreme. It's fun to play a rhythm game to, get the rhythm right, even though it doesn't involve, strategic difficulty, I would argue. So this leads me to my conclusion, which I will give right before Mr.FOoT's. There is another element here, which I would call, I kind of hinted at earlier, like improvisational difficulty, maybe. The appeal of accepting that limited time is more than just a self-imposed restriction. How limited the time is subjective, but that the time is limited, the time you have to play the game is limited, that is not personal. Like, everyone has limited time. There is no infinite time, right? And so adding that to a game, giving the game the perspective that you cannot attempt this infinite times, you often don't actually know how many times you can attempt it based on how much time you have. That feeling of needing to do the best you can with the time you have, I believe is the most common, basic, meaningful form of difficulty. Most games don't have the strategic build system thing that I described before that resolves that conflict that way. So I think the other way to think of it is that for most games, it's that you do the best you can with the time you have, like life. You're not going to get it perfect. If the challenge is really, really time intensive, I almost said hard, but as we just discussed, maybe it isn't hard. I feel like, does that need to be what you spend your limited time on? You won't be able to do that good. You won't be able to make a good attempt in the time you have. I'm going to give you one more example to drive that point home. Sekiro, Shadows Die Twice, is the example I always use. Now, in this game, some enemies are programmed so that their attacks don't hit when you would logically think they would. So, for example, an enemy will jump up at you to do a plunging attack. And your brain goes, okay, if they jumped here, they're going to hit now, so I should parry now. And the game is programmed so that instead of that happening, the enemy floats in midair for a second, so that if you try to intuit the right timing, if you try to do the best you can with the time you have, you will get it wrong. You have to just dump time into it to memorize when is the right time. And it's okay if people find that fulfilling. Again, we've drawn out how that can be meaningful. There is skill, challenge, merit involved in being able to overcome that time investment. But I would argue that for most people, it doesn't really make sense unless you're specifically interested in overcoming that thing. Unless you are interested in training, I would argue mostly mentally, mostly for benefits that are unrelated to video games, there really is no reason to design a game that way. It truly is a waste of time, except for people that want that one thing. You've designed a game that upchucks the most common way that people find a game fun, which is to just do their best. The game is programmed in a way where you can't do your best. You could think of it that way. Like there is no doing your best. You must simply memorize the timing. You can't intuit it. There is no, strategy is only secondary to you memorizing the timing. I haven't played a ton of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. I'm just using that one bit as an example. I'm not talking about the game specifically. That doesn't matter. It's just an archetype of games like that in general, of that type of game design. I say that doesn't matter. I just mean I'm not invested in critiquing that game. That's not my point. But I think it's interesting to consider how that type of difficulty is very at odds with the desire to make a game that you simply must put time into to overcome. There are not a lot of forms of difficulty or appeal in games and in life that are mutually exclusive, and I think it's interesting that that is one of them. You can't really have a game where you must engage the mechanical difficulty, and you also get to enjoy trying the best you can at the same time. That Sekiro example I gave is an example of game design that prevents you from trying your best. Like, you will accomplish nothing if you try your best with the time you have. You have to just spend some variable, personal amount of time that, again, you could argue is meaningful. It's still mentally taxing to learn over that period of time. But to me, that resolves the most of the mental confusion about that subject. I hope that feels meaningful. So again, I would argue there is something kind of beyond these forms of difficulty. I'll conclude that a little bit more at the end. But the other way I would summarize difficulty in general is that it's about how close to a non-self-imposed difficulty limited time is, and fun as well. There just is not much logical reason to play most games except to have fun. And so since you more or less have to have your goal involve having fun and having limited time and doing the best you can, the taste that comes from calibrating those 4 forms of difficulty to your liking makes sense at that point. They're not as meaningless as they at first appear, even though they all boil down to just spending more time, because you can't just spend more time up to a point. Okay. Mr. Fruit's epilogue, closing thoughts. You said this was originally supposed to be my parlay for December. I'd thought of this new way to talk about a concept that is really vague in our usual gaming discourse. The thought arrived in the end sort of invalidates the original raison d'etre of this parlay, and it has me questioning whether I know anything about game design at all. People like iPatchNotes create super well thought out game design parlay every month, and I wanted to match that, but I feel like I failed with mine. Special thanks to Densoro for helping me with this request, and hopefully there's something we can learn from discussing this mess. I don't think you did bad at all. That's awful. I thought this was great. I genuinely thought this was very well organized. It's challenging to fit this much. Like, this is quite long for a parlay request. This pushes the limits of where I will, I mean, and this is okay, I guess, but it pushes the limits of me being able to say my own thing, that's all right, I guess. Maybe if I don't feel good about that, I should write that in the service, but just that I gather you want that, and it makes it hard to read at a steady cadence. But besides that, no, like, don't beat yourself up like that. You're right. iPatchNotes has very long, involved parlay, basically the equivalent of writing videos for their own channel, which is part of the reason they buy parlay, they tell me. And that is impressive. That is a lot. I feel you've done the same thing. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just a few words before we go then. I said that I kind of wanted to reach beyond, now that we've gotten to this point, I feel like Mr.FOoT is despairing. I actually considered this to just be the starting point for game design. We now understand, as game designers, which we are fledgling game designers after this conversation, if you followed this conversation, you have taken a 101 class in making a fun video game, as far as I'm concerned. Not to toot my own horn, I'm just saying Mr.FOoT did that. We've got kind of three takeaways. The first one is that the difference between the different kinds of difficulty is only partial. They can all be overcome by just spending time. Players' motivations for playing a game themselves are the true form of difficulty. That is why challenges would ever be impossible to overcome. It would be because of the player. Given no human limitations, there is no challenge, really. The hard thing is when you add in human elements to how a game makes it not immediate to overcome a task. And your taste for these things somewhat depends on just what form of challenge you want. Again, maybe you want a guarantee of progression, mathematical difficulty, as Mr.FOoT put it. Maybe you really want to test your determination against the game's difficulty. You could be interested in mechanical difficulty. Maybe you really like to learn a lot about a system. This also reminds me a little bit of like reading some kinds of books, knowledge-based difficulty. Maybe you want to adapt your way of thinking to whatever challenges the game presents, the strategic difficulty. And I think the only value judgment to be passed is that it is worth considering how, depending on which type of challenge you're experiencing, some of them are a lot less personal. It isn't much you to participate in mathematical difficulty. You can just kind of do it. Whereas strategic difficulty, I would argue, is almost all you. It almost doesn't even exist before the player deciding that they want to have fun or, have limited time. If a player didn't care about doing things their own way, I would argue that strategic difficulty largely dissolves into the other forms of difficulty. What is the shortest mathematical difficulty way to abuse the knowledge difficulty knowledge to overcome the mechanic, to trivialize the mechanical difficulty enough that you can do it? And if you only care about those things, I would argue there almost isn't strategy, or there would just be a relatively optimal strategy that would emerge, and then you would take it. Indeed, I think in many of the build-based games I've played, there are decisions that if you had no personal desires, it is kind of obvious what you should decide to do. Like, this thing is obviously very good in a way that I feel like is about the game's systems. It's not that it's obvious to me, although if you look at players at large, it's interesting that most people agree. There will often be things that are pretty obviously good. And I think these are usually designed intentionally. The designer knows all of this stuff and has put something in place so that players that don't care about strategical difficulty can just bypass it. Like, there's no need. You don't have to do that part. It's ideal for a game to let you modulate these somewhat. And one reason I think builds are so interesting, so quintessentially gamey, is that they are essentially a system by which you can customize a game's difficulty ratios, like types of difficulty. That's interesting. Just because they all kind of boil down to overcoming time doesn't mean there isn't still something satisfying in having a mix of them. And you can't just use time, because we have limited time, to overcome all these things. Players also just don't play games that way. Most people, technically it is only a self-imposed difficulty, but in practice, no human is willing to put infinite effort into the challenge of a game. And so putting challenges in front of players and challenging them, pushing them, and encouraging them to try to solve them with their own wit instead of by just dumping time into them is something you could do. Like, that is a phenomenon. For example, Disco Elysium has some design where early in the game, failing some stat checks actually benefits the player, as if the game is trying to say, don't feel like you need to get it right. You're just meant to tell a story and do the best you can expressing yourself. In other words, the game is saying, we don't care about those forms of objective difficulty. We only care about your forms of difficulty, you having fun. You could view role-playing games in general as being that, if you wanted to. And to the extent that they include those other forms of difficulty, the player can anchor themselves to those things, sure, but there is no game without the player having some self-directed goal. So I would argue it's not so weird to have a game where there isn't much to do unless the player decides, they want to do that. That is always true of games. It's just more true, a lot more true, of some other games. But yeah, I think it's largely about taste. I don't think this means that nothing can be hard, personally, in a meaningful way, beyond just time expenditure. It's just important to realize that if all you do is add difficulties that are objective coded into the game, you haven't really made something meaningful to play. You've made something challenging. You've made something that immature people will brag about completing. But did you really make a game? I would define a game as something that mixes those challenges and engaging self-imposed difficulties from the player, that is aware of those things and mixes them, engages all those things. So I don't think that this is a death knell for having a game be challenging. I just think it's a way to consider how a game being really challenging maybe just doesn't mean much. Maybe just don't bother. I don't think that is the same either as people who act like, oh, so you'll never engage with anything challenging. Look, life is going to be plenty challenging for people without them playing a challenging video game, okay? Has life been trivially easy to you so far? Screw off. So yeah, that's all I have to say. A really long parlay that I thought was really cool. I had a ton to say, so I hope you felt like you took some stuff away and I wasn't too incoherent. Mr. Food, I thought you gave me a great structure to work with. Thanks very much.